What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, welcome. I hope everybody is having a great day. Today we have another Versus. This time we're doing two very popular MMOs, Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars 2. Just real quick before we get started, I want to thank everybody who supported the channel. We're really close to 100 subs, so I want to thank everybody who's liked, disliked, sub, commented. It really goes a long way, and I want you to know I appreciate you. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started on the game model. Final Fantasy XIV's game model is a long-gone tradition. If you want to get in, you have to purchase the base game, which is normally around $20 US, and that doesn't include any of the 4 expansions that released. Now, the other alternative to buying the base game is getting the latest expansion, which can run you between $40 to $60 US, and that'll get you the base game and all the expansions to go along with it. The next part of the model is the monthly subscription fee to access the game. The fee will run you roughly $14.99 US to play. However, when you buy the game, something to note is that you do get your first 30 days of game time for free. Now, in this day and age, that may turn a lot of people off. Outside of Final Fantasy, the only MMO I can think of with the mandatory subscription fee is World of Warcraft. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a bad thing to have a subscription fee, because with it you gain access to all future updates for free, and Final Fantasy offers a premium experience. The only thing that you will have to pay for outside of the subscription fee will be the expansion packs, which normally releases every 2 years. Something important that I wanted to add as well is that Final Fantasy does offer a really good free trial of the game, which allows you to progress all the way up to level 60 with a few minor restrictions. That's a big deal because you're getting a nice chunk of the game, and normally by the time you hit level 60, you will have identified if the game is for you or not without spending $1. Now, outside of the sub fee and a box purchase, Final Fantasy does offer a cash shop. Most of the items in the cash shop are skins, mounts, housing items, appearance changes, more storage, and things like that. As far as progression items, there are character level skips that level your character or job up to level 80, and for reference, the max level is 90. And they do have story skips as well, if playing through the story isn't your thing. I think that'll do it for Final Fantasy. Let's check out Guild Wars 2. So, Guild Wars 2 is more in line with today's models of MMOs, and that's free to play. If you want to try the game out, you simply go to their website or Steam, download it, and you're in. Now, the free-to-play version of the game only gets you access to the base game. There are 3 different expansions and a few DLCs to get if you want the full experience. Getting all 3 expansions will set you back roughly $60 US, and if you're looking to include all the DLCs, you're looking at roughly $100 US. Outside of that, Guild Wars doesn't offer any monthly subscription fee or anything like that. However, Guild Wars 2 does have a cash shop, and that's where things really start to differ in terms of the model. Guild Wars cash shop is much more aggressive than Final Fantasy, and there are some things that almost feel mandatory to purchase in order to have a good time. The cash shop is comprised of most things I listed for Final Fantasy, things like skins, mount skins, appearance changes, bag and bank space, stuff like that. Now, there are some pay for progression items such as max level characters and XP boost as well. So a lot of the things I mentioned about the cash shop for Guild Wars, Final Fantasy has a lot of the same things. So why does it feel mandatory here? Well, it's all about how Guild Wars sets you up. See, Guild Wars doesn't give you a lot of bank or bag space initially. So the only way to get that extra space is by spending, and that's just one example of it. Now, the bright spot of all this is that the premium currency for Guild Wars 2 can be earned in-game. You just have to earn enough gold and then exchange it for the premium currency. So if you're someone who is effective at earning in-game gold, you wouldn't have to spend your own money on premium currency. But I think that wraps it up for the game models, so let's jump into the game world. Final Fantasy's world is beautiful. Despite the game being almost 10 years old, it's still visually appealing and holds up well. Now, the world is broken up into multiple zones, so traveling from one zone to another will net you a loading screen. It's important for me to mention that because I know for some, it can be a deal breaker because it ruins immersion. These zones are fairly big in size, and you'll spend time navigating them on land, in the air, and at sea. Some different things you'll be doing in these zones include questing, gathering, finding landmarks, and things like that. Now, for as beautiful as the world is, I feel it does lack a sense of aliveness, if that's a word. The world feels empty and barren with not much to do or really explore. There are no NPCs walking around to create that immersion. You'll see NPCs in some of the zones, but they are normally relegated to the zone's main town, and for the most part, they're static. For the zones to be as big as they are, they lack explorability. There are no secret passages and portals to find or anything like that. There are world events called fates that require groups to do for the most part, but outside of the early game, they'll mostly be empty. And that's really the state of the game world. Empty. No one is out doing anything because the game doesn't really incentivize you to leave the hub area. The best part of the game world in Final Fantasy is the hub areas because that's where everyone is at. They feel very lively, tons of people are around interacting with one another. It's a really great place to be. But I think that wraps it up for Final Fantasy's game world. Let's check out Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 has an amazing world, and I think that's an understatement. Now, visually, I think the game looks okay, and that's mainly because it has a more stylized look to it. I think a lot of the areas of the game could use a graphical update, but that's not to say it looks bad by any means, just more so dated. However, the game world looks much better once you're in the expansion zones, and you can tell right away. Like Final Fantasy, Guild Wars is broken up into multiple zones, and it will net you a loading screen from going from one zone to the next. I'd say the zones are roughly the same size as Final Fantasy, and you'll navigate them via land, air, and water. Now, this is where I think Guild Wars really shines. The world designs are amazing, and there are a ton of things to do in each zone for map completion. Not only that, the world has a lot of explorability to them. So let me bring back the word aliveness, because Guild Wars embodies that. You'll see NPCs walking around requesting help for world events, NPCs out fighting enemies that may need to be revived at times. Not to mention you always see other players running around because the game incentivizes you to go out and do things in the world. And that's what I mean by aliveness. To top it all off, Guild Wars has what some say are the best world events in any MMO, where you will see hundreds of people waiting for them to start. Now, Guild Wars does have main hubs as well, and they seem to be just as alive as the rest of the zones. Outside of the world events, map completion, or hanging out in the hub, you'll be gathering, questing, and doing challenges, and other things like that. Now that we've explored the worlds, let's jump into the combat. Final Fantasy's combat follows the more traditional tap targeting setup. There is no live action combat, everything is done by manually selecting the target and then attacking. Now, I know for a lot of people that may be a turnoff, but I'm here to say the combat feels good in the hands and plays very smooth. So, combat really kicks off with whatever class or job that you're playing. Something to note before I continue diving in is that Final Fantasy does follow the Holy Trinity, and for those who are not familiar with it, you fall into one of three categories: tank, healer, or DPS. Now, your character is not locked into any of those one roles, as you can switch your class at any time. Now, the basis of combat will revolve around you using abilities that have cooldowns, while weaving in abilities that are off the global cooldown, while maintaining and utilizing your class's unique job mechanics and resources. So, just to go a little bit more in depth, every time you use a regular ability, you have a 2.5 second cooldown. During that cooldown, you cannot use any of your other regular abilities. That's where your off global cooldown abilities come into effect, because you'll be able to use those abilities during that 2.5 second cooldown. Now, Final Fantasy does have a lot of button inputs, so if you're not a fan of that, this may not be for you. Depending on your class determines the amount of abilities and inputs pressed. Now, over the years, the devs have done a great job at minimizing ability bloat, but I will say that you will press more buttons within combat than most games. On average, I would say most classes have about 20-ish skills that they constantly use throughout fights. And at first glance, this can seem a bit overwhelming and a lot to learn, but once you do, it's such a satisfying feeling. But I think this wraps it up for the combat here. Let's check out Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2's combat is unique. It's a blend between live action and targeting, except you don't have to click to target an enemy unless you want to. Instead, you point your cursor in the designated area and start attacking. This is something that can take some getting used to, as it can get a bit messy when there are a lot of things going on around you when trying to select the right target. Thankfully, you can select the targets by clicking on them or by mapping a button to select targets. And this really only applies to ranged classes. So, similarly to Final Fantasy, Guild Wars combat kicks off by what class you select. Where things start to differ is the overall setup. See, whereas Final Fantasy has the traditional Holy Trinity system, Guild Wars 2 follows a looser version, meaning there are no classes set in stone. That should be tank, healer, or DPS. Instead, each class in Guild Wars has a subclass that may suit your personal preference, like being more tanky or providing support. Now, your class isn't the only determining factor. Choosing your weapon plays a big role as well. Depending on what class you are determines what weapons you can use. Each class has a set list of weapons to choose from, and those weapon abilities are unique to that class. A great example of this is the Guardian and the Mesmer class. They both can use a greatsword, but the abilities are completely different in how they are used. Now, the basis of combat will revolve around you attacking enemies with normal attacks and using abilities. Within combat, you'll swap weapons to gain access to new weapon skills as well. Next, I wanted to talk about the button input since it was something that I mentioned for Final Fantasy. And for Guild Wars, I would say the ability usage feels about the same, maybe slightly less. Typically, you'll be looking at about 15 to 20 abilities within combat. However, Guild Wars feels a bit more spammy and feels like it has a much higher action per minute, and that may be due to the game having a much lower global cooldown than Final Fantasy, so you can get to your next ability much faster. But this sums it up for the combat. Let's jump into the content offerings. Final Fantasy XIV is rich with content, and you'll find no short of offerings here. I think it's fair to say that PvE content is its strongest offering. For my PvE players, if you're into story questing, dungeons, raids, crafting, you'll feel right at home because they have all of that in abundance. Now, for my PvP players, they do have small scale objective based and a larger frontline mode that puts 3 factions against one another. Let's talk PvE first. The main thing is the main storyline, and at this point I think it's mainly what the game is known for. And it's phenomenal. In my opinion, it's one of the best stories told in an MMO. Next, let's talk dungeons, because you'll run a lot of them. Dungeons are done in a party of 4, where you go through, kill some enemies, fight a boss, and get out. There are over 50 dungeons to be had, including hard mode versions as well. So, on to raids. There are 2 versions of raids. Alliance raids, which are 24-man, and then Trials, which is a team of 8 taking on a boss. If you're someone who likes a challenge and want the world's first title, this may be for you because the Trials have varying modes of difficulty, which increases them in mechanics and really require a group to be on the same page. Lastly, you have crafting, which is a very well fleshed out system which will allow you to do a lot of things like be an armorer or weapon crafting, not to mention you have gathering skills to go along with it. I wouldn't say this is a game to be solely a life skill player, but it does bring a lot of purpose to the game. So, on to PvP. To be honest with you, PvP in this game is generally an afterthought, and it always has been, and I think it will remain that way. But that won't stop me from talking about the modes that are here, and there are 2 main ones. Frontline Assault and Crystalline Conflict. You also have dueling as well. Now, Frontline Assault is a 24v24v24 objective-based game mode that sees you capturing certain items until your team reaches a maximum score. It's pure chaos to say the least. Next is Crystalline Conflict, which is more small scale and is 5v5, where you and your team must transport a crystal along the map. This is definitely the better of the 2 modes if you ask me. And lastly, there's dueling if you like to fight one-on-one and flex. And there you have it for the content for Final Fantasy. It's a PvE player's paradise, but leaves a lot to be desired for the PvP players. Now, let's go see what Guild Wars has to offer. Guild Wars has a great blend of PvE and PvP content. So for my PvE players, if you like story questing, dungeons, raids, challenges, jumping puzzles, Guild Wars has you covered. And for my PvP players, if you like large scale, small scale, ranked, and even custom matches, look no further. Let's talk PvE first. Guild Wars story is good. I don't think it's great, but it's worth paying attention to. Next are the dungeons, which are mainly referred to as fractals, which are 5 players. The cool thing about these is that you can scale the difficulty prior to entering them, and the higher the difficulty, the greater the reward. Now for the raids. They have 2 different kinds of raids. One which follows the traditional format with multiple encounters. Then they have strike missions, which are more akin to Final Fantasy's trial missions, but just with 10 people. Another great part of the PvE is the crafting and gathering. Like Final Fantasy, this is a great system for making gold and things like that, but I don't believe this is a game where you can say I'm going to be a pure life skiller. Lastly, for the PvE is the open world content and map completion, which I partially mentioned earlier when talking about the game world, but there are a lot of different challenges, puzzles, jumping puzzles, and things like that in the world to do that will net you rewards. Now let's talk PvP. Guild Wars has a great PvP scene. PvP is normally broken up into small scale or large scale. Small scale is 5v5 and matches are objective based game modes like Conquest. Now for the really competitive people who want a challenge, they do have ranked PvP as well. For the large scale PvP, this is World v World, which normally pits servers against one another using siege weaponry and things like that to gain and capture territory. Lastly, Guild Wars does offer custom PvP matches if you want to have some fun and do things like 2v2 or 3v3 deathmatch. And that's about it for the content in Guild Wars 2. I think the game does a great job at providing meaningful content for both parties. Now that we've looked at the game models, the world you play in, the combat, the types of content the game offers, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Overall, I think you have two really good MMOs that have a ton of content to offer. As always, I think it comes down to personal preference. I believe Final Fantasy has the better PvE experience from the story to the dungeons and raids. It's just more polished in my opinion. While Guild Wars offers a better PvP experience and more of an MMO feel, and its content is much more balanced than Final Fantasy. If you're someone who wants the best of both worlds, Guild Wars 2 is the way to go. Now, I know I could have went a lot more in depth, but I really wanted to keep this surface level as I didn't want to be here all day. This video really just serves as a basis if you're trying to decide between the two. As for me, I have played countless hours of both games, and I think Guild Wars 2 is the better MMO. It just has more of an MMO feel that I look for. But enough of what I think. I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments below. What did you think about this versus video? Which game do y'all like better and why? Have you ever played these games? Let me know, but that's all I got for now. I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and if y'all did, please drop a like and a sub. It goes a long way, and I got more coming. Catch y'all next time.